because it was a farm, there was little work for me to do as a child. Sometimes we would feed the chickens, or I would chase after the birds that the master would shoot. Allowance day, which was the day where we were given food, clothing. Those of us who did not work, the small ones, we were barely given a little shirt that maybe would come down to our knees. And so winter, spring, in the cold, in the hot, it didn't matter. This is what we had on. And when that wore out, you basically went around the plantation naked. I can tell you that I suffered greatly of cold and heat. Sometimes it would get so cold that I would crawl into one of the sacks that they would use to gather corn. My feet were so cracked that you could put a pencil in the cracks of my feet. It was also here on the plantation as a young man that I saw the cruelty of slavery. When I saw my aunt beaten severely for being impotent, as they say. Talking back, beaten severely. The plantation life for young children was not good. It was a place where you would see cruelty. It was a place where you had to fight. I dealt with hunger. I would fight the old dog Nep for the crumbs that the girl would, when she's cleaning the tablecloth, and the crumbs and the old bones that would come off of the tablecloth, and I'm fighting the dogs for that. Oh, it was a luxury to just be able to take a piece of bread and dip it in the water that meat had been cooked in. How great it was just to have a piece of the rind from bacon. It was just a luxury for us. One of the most opportune events that happened in my life early on was when I was chosen to be sent to my second master, Hugh All, and I was sent to Baltimore. I was about 7 years old. And when I went to Baltimore and we got off the ship, and I was greeted by Master All, and I was greeted by his wife. His wife was just this, she just gave out this countenance of beauty, and she was so kind. You know, we were so used to looking down and not looking folks in the eye, and we were used to just bowing down, and she didn't do that. She was not used to slavery. She was a weaver by trade, and she didn't know yet how to treat slaves. You couldn't help but walk away when you connected with her you couldn't help but walk away just beaming, just to be in her presence. I must tell you that slavery would soon harden that heart. Slavery would soon make her as cruel as other slave owners. It did not take long. One of the first things that Mrs. All did was to teach me how to read. She started teaching me how to read. She taught me the ABCs, and she taught me how to write and read words of 3 and 4 letters. I would also, my job was to take care of her son. And I would take his workbooks, and I would go behind him, and I would fill in the blanks that he didn't fill in. And it was that way that I learned how to read and write. It was one day when Mrs. Auld was giving me one of my lessons, is when Master Auld came in. And he said, "What are you doing?" teaching young Freddie how to read. They call me Freddie. I was teaching young Freddie how to read. He said, "No, I forbid you from doing that. You cannot do that." Teaching that man, teaching that slave how to read and write will make him unfit to be a slave, will make him unmanageable and make him restless. You must stop immediately. And it was then that I understood the pathway to freedom. Why is it that he wanted to keep this away from me? What was so special about being able to read and write, to have an education? This idea that I would not be fit to be a slave. Yes, it was at that time that I understood that I was not fit to be a slave, and that freedom belonged to me as well. It was not long after that quite frankly, Mrs. Auld became more of an impediment than Master Auld. She would get angry when she would see me with a magazine or a book. She would snatch it from me with great anger. Yes, she had learned the ways of slavery. Yes, she had learned the ways of so-called civilized society in the South. To keep the slaves ignorant, to make them content. Well, I must tell you that learning how to read and write erased all my contentment. And even as a 7-year-old, I began to understand that, yes, there's something else out there, and that one day I would become free. I would go into the streets of Baltimore to run errands, and I would play with the little white boys down at the docks, especially down at Fells Point. And I would encourage them, and sometimes I would trick them into playing games where I would learn new words. Or I would challenge them. I bet you can't write this word, or I bet you can't read this word. And they would say, "Oh, sure I can." And they would read the word, and of course I would pay attention, and I would understand. I spent 7 years in Baltimore, and I learned a lot in Baltimore. I became fairly proficient in reading and writing, though it was something that I had to keep a secret. Mrs. Auld knew that I was a good reader and I was a good writer, but this was something that she started. And maybe she felt guilty, but she would turn that guilt into anger towards me. So I spent about 7 years in Baltimore, and based on a dispute between Hugh Auld and Thomas Auld, his brother, I was sent back to St. Michael's where Thomas Auld lived. And I had not been around Thomas Auld for quite some time. We were not acquainted with each other. As they say, I had an attitude. Did not listen. And so when I first got there, the first week with Thomas Auld, he beat me severely. I was 14 years old. He beat me severely, webs on my back, slashes, gashes in my back that you could stick a finger in, because I talked back. And no matter how much he beat me, no matter how severely he beat me, he was not able to break me. Frustrated and not being able to break me, he decides to send me to Mr. Edward Covey. Now, Mr. Edward Covey was known as a slave breaker. Mr. Edward Covey had a reputation in that local slave owners would send slaves like myself to be broken. And they would spend a year with Mr. Covey. Mr. Covey was also known as a Christian man, which amazingly enhanced his reputation. And so I went to live with Mr. Covey on the 1st of January after Christmas. For the first 6 months that I stayed with Mr. Covey, scarcely a week went by that I wasn't severely beaten. Mr. Covey was a man who worked. He knew hard work, unlike many of the other masters, and so he knew how much a man or a boy could do. Mr. Covey, sometimes when we're out working in the fields, he would come out and he would sneak up on us to see, to make sure that we were doing our work. Any little thing would get you severely beaten. It was never too hot. It was never too cold. The longest day wasn't long enough. The shortest night wasn't long enough for him. Hail, snow, rain, it didn't matter when, we were out there working. Between the work and being beaten severely, finally I was broken. On the one day that we had off on Sundays, I would go and I would sit by a tree and I would watch the boats go by off the Chesapeake Bay, wishing that I was the wind, wishing that I was on one of those boats, and wondering, God, why me? Why am I a slave? Why am I being treated this way? What can I do? But I was broken. Behold, he had turned a man into a brute. I didn't care. I was depressed, and I did my work. One day, Mr. Covey sent me out with a team of oxen to go get wood. And I went out to the woods, and I did not know how. I was a young man. I did not know how to work a team of oxen. I didn't know. He just told me, take this in one hand, take this rope in the other hand, and go out and get wood. And so I go out, and I figure it out. And we get to the woods. And as I'm gathering wood, the oxen decide to just run off. And they're running off in the woods. They're going off in the briars. They're breaking the cart. They're doing all these things. I finally catch up with them, thinking I'm going to be dashed to bits. I finally catch up with the oxen, and I did not get the wood, but I figured I had been gone so long that I had to get back. And so I get back, and as we come to the gate, the oxen take off again. And they come, and they're dashing everywhere. The cart is broken, and here comes Mr. Covey. He said, gather that cart and let's go back out to the woods, and I'll show you how to gather wood. And so we go back to the place where I was going to gather wood, and as we stand there, he tells me, take off all your clothes. And while I'm standing there, he grabs a willow and he starts. His intent was to whip me. And he did. He severely whipped me to the point that I ran off. And this is something that a lot of slaves would do. You hear about a lot of slaves who would escape. A lot of times they just simply escape to the woods to just not be beat. Mr. Covey looked for me. I hid in the cornfields, and he couldn't find me. I came back. He wanted to whip me, and I ran off again. This time, I ran off, and I fell in with a man named Sandy. Sandy was a slave, but he lived with a free woman. Before I got up with Sandy, I had gone to my master, Thomas All, to say, can you please take me to another home? This man is going to kill me. But Master All said, no, you need to go back because it's costing me money. He gave me some salts, rubbed some salve on my wounds. He said, you can spend the night here, but you got to go back. And so I headed back, and I fell in with Sandy. Sandy was one of those old African types. He believed in a lot of the superstitions. He said, yes, you do need to go back, but let's go over here. There's a spot in the woods I want to show you. And so he takes me over to the woods, and he grabs a root. And he said, you know, you need to take this root, and you need to put it in your pocket. Put this root in your pocket, and no man will beat you. And of course, it's a superstition. What is this? I don't believe that this would work. But Sandy seemed to know what he was talking about. I had never known him to be beat, and he had a pretty decent life. And so I head back to the farm, wondering what's going to happen. And this is on a Sunday, so it's Sabbath day. And as I go to the gate of the farm, here comes Mr. Covey with his wife, and they're headed to church. And as if nothing had happened, he says, oh, Frederick, there you are. Why don't you go and, can I have you go feed the chickens? And just as a matter of fact, just go feed the chickens and do this and whatever. It gave me all these things to do. And I did it. And I'm like, oh, okay. This root, maybe this root does work. The next day, Mr. Covey tells me, go out to the barn. I want you to rub, curry, and feed the horses, which I was happy to do. And so I go to the barn, and I go up into the loft and start putting hay down. And as I'm coming down the ladder, Covey breaks in, and he's got a rope, and he grabs me by my legs. His intent was to tie me up, and who knows what was going to happen after that. It was then, from I don't know where, but the Spirit came to me to fight back. He grabbed my legs, and as he grabbed my legs, I was on the ladder. I sprung back, and I got on the floor. We both were on the floor, and as he was trying to whip my legs, I turned over, and I grabbed him by the neck, and I picked him up. And you can see the blood coming from my fingers where I was grabbing him by the neck. He called out to Bill, who was one of his hands. Help me, help me. Bill comes over and tries to tie up my hand. And as I still had Covey by the neck, I gave a great kick right under the ribs to Bill, and he walked away. He called one of his other hands, help, help. He said, you know, and the other man said, my master didn't send me here to beat slaves. He just sent me here to work, and he walked away. Covey and I grappled for over 2 hours. Rolling over, he's tried to get sticks to beat me, and he tried to get me by the neck, but I just held on for dear life. And we grappled, until finally he let go, and he stepped away, and he says, you're lucky I didn't come down on you harder than this. The next time, you better be careful. But in truth, it was I who was the victor. It was I that drew blood. He drew no blood from me. And for the next 6 months of my time in Mr. Covey, he never laid a finger on me. Now, every now and then, he would say, when I was impotent or when I was just speaking out, he would say, now don't let me get a hold of you again. And I would say, hey, you sure better not get a hold of me again, or it's going to be worse off than it did the first time we got together. Now, it always perplexed me as to why he did not take me to the courthouse to fight a slave owner the way I did would have you hung, or at least severely beaten to death. But he wouldn't do that because he had a reputation to uphold. And if it was to get out that someone like myself had beaten him and would not take his punishment, he would lose his reputation and his great source of income. So again, for the last 6 months, he did not put a hand on me. I went to I was hired out after a year. I was hired out to several other farms, but I had a reputation. I had made up my mind at this point that I would never be beaten again. I had made up my mind that the white man that sought to succeed to beat me would also have to succeed to kill me. It was then that I realized that I needed to escape. It was then that I realized that I needed to seek freedom. And though freedom was still years away, I knew in my mind that while I may be a slave in form, that was no longer a slave in fact. I lived with several folks, and I ended up going back to Mr. Thomas Auld. Thomas Auld, my reputation that I had built up, Thomas Auld had understood this, and he decided, I'm just not going to deal with Freddie. And so he sent me back to Baltimore. So I go back to Baltimore to live with Mr. Hugh, and he allowed me to hire out my time. I had gained a skill as a caulker over on the docks. It was also the way I learned more words when I paid attention to what the shipbuilders were doing. And so I would make money as a caulker, but then I would have to go to Mr. Hugh, and I would have to give him this money. And every now and then, as thinking that he was doing me a favor, he would give me maybe 6 cents out of $6 that I had earned, thinking that he was doing me some great favor, when in fact it was making me even madder. That he thought, because I knew that I deserved the whole, and the fact that he thought that just giving me 6 cents out of $6, maybe it made him feel better, but it made me mad to think that I was giving him my money. And it was then, while I was in Baltimore, I met my beloved Anna Murray. And she helped me escape, and she helped me gain my freedom. This would have been September, around 1838. In previous talks about my life, I generally did not talk about Anna and her role in my escape, or any of the other people who played a role, because I wanted to protect them. When I was writing these narratives, writing the autobiographies and whatnot, there were still many people who were enslaved. before I escaped, I must tell you that I was hesitant because of the people that I loved, because of the friends that I had gathered in Baltimore and the danger that they would be put in. I also was hesitant because I knew that if I was caught, again, because this is not the first time that I had escaped, that I would be sent with Georgia traders and I would be sent down to Georgia or Alabama or Mississippi, which was certain death at some point for me. So Anna had the idea that we would get some free papers from someone in the area, and we ended up getting free papers from a young man who was a sailor. Now, sailors had these papers. They weren't really free papers, but there were papers that indicated that they had free reign, that they could travel all over the world. There were verified papers with stamps and the American Eagle on the paper, very official looking. Anna made me a sailor's uniform with a little cravat around and a little hat. And I also knew the lingo of the sailor, so I was able to talk like a sailor. I was able to walk like a sailor and act like a sailor. And so I got on the train, headed for New York. So I got on the train and I sat in the Negro car, and we were pretty far away from Baltimore when the conductor comes to ask for our papers. This was it, I thought. Either I'm going to be known and put in jail, or freedom was just around the corner. The man comes, he asked me, "Do you have your freedom papers?" I said, "No, sir, I never travel with my freedom papers, but I do have this." And I showed him my sailor's papers. Now, had he inspected it more closely, he would have seen that the man that was described in these papers looked nothing like me. But he looked at it, the papers looked authentic, and he gave them back to me. And the next thing I know, I was in New York, and I was free. But I didn't know what to do. A man was able to help me because I needed to get to Philadelphia. And a man was able to help me. How do I get to Philadelphia? And he took me towards the depot, and he took me to Philadelphia. And eventually I was able to send for Anna, and we were married. We stayed with the great abolitionist, Mr. David Ruggles, for a while. And eventually he found me work in New Bedford. He knew I was a caulker. He knew I had these skills. And we went to live with a family. We went to live with the Johnson family. Now, I changed my name a little bit. Of course, my given name was Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. That was the name my mother gave me. At one point, I changed my name to Stanley. And then I decided to change my name to Johnson, but then I realized there were so many Johnsons. Too many Johnsons, so I did not want to be a Johnson. Mr. Johnson, who I was staying with, was reading a book called Lady of the Lake. And there was a character called Douglas. And he thought Douglas would be a good name. And so it was then that I became Frederick Douglass. And Anna Murray became Anna Murray Douglas. And so that's the story of how I got my name. That's the story of how I gained my freedom. There's so much more to tell, after this, but I know that we don't have that kind of time. And so I will leave you with that story. If there are folks who may want to ask questions, if I can recollect, because it's been so long. But I will leave you, if people would like to ask questions, especially the young ones here. Anybody have a question? No? Well, I want to thank you for coming and listening to my story. Again, there is so much more to tell that we just don't have time for. My life was a life of misery and woe. My life was replicated by so many millions of enslaved Africans that were brought to this country. My life is just a snapshot of what happened to so many other people. But my life was also one of triumph, because I held true to hope that freedom would come someday. I held true to the God that I believe did not want us to be enslaved. I held true to that. I was almost broken. But I found the spirit to move on. Yes, sir.
Forgive my ignorance. When you were in Philadelphia, did you work with Quaker abolitionist organizations, or what was your relationship with the Quakers?
When I first escaped, I was with David Ruggles, who was a black abolitionist, and he primarily helped me to get a job. I was not interested in being an abolitionist. I was not interested in being a part of that work. I was just happy to be free and to work. It wasn't until I started going to some of the meetings in New Bedford, and there was a Quaker, who I believe his last name was Coffin, and he encouraged me to tell my story. He encouraged me to tell my story. I was hesitant, being one of little education, not being a public speaker, but I did, and I told my story. And it was then that I began my career as a speaker, as an abolitionist. Dangerous as it was, because I was a wanted man. I had escaped slavery, and of course, you know, slavery was the law of the land. And so my master, Thomas Auld, had told me several times that he would go through any lengths to get me if I was to try to escape. The whole idea was, what you have to understand is that slave owners truly thought that they could make their slaves content to be slaves. And this is where this myth that we hear about slaves being content, that's where that comes from. Why would anybody be content with being enslaved? Why would anybody be content with being fed just enough food, and that food being corn mush? And so I realized that I needed to work to help those who were still enslaved. And so I started speaking. Now, when I first started speaking, people didn't believe that I had even been enslaved. I had listened to orators. I learned how to read and write before I ever gained freedom. And so people thought that I was a fraud. People thought that, that I was an imposter. This was someone that they found to tell the story, a made-up story, in terms of the abolitionists, because the abolitionists were not exactly looked on as the best people back then, especially folks in the South. And so this is why I wrote the narratives. This is why I wrote the autobiography, because people didn't think that I wrote them. And so eventually, yes, we did do work in Philadelphia. We did do work in New York. We left New Bedford and we went to Rochester. And Rochester is where we did most of our work. Rochester is where we started the North Star. I first started writing for the Liberator. And then I created my own paper, the North Star. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
I understand you visited President Lincoln in the White House. Could you say something about that?
So when the Civil War started, black men, or just black people in general, enslaved Africans, were leaving their plantations in droves. And they were going to where the army was. Now, the Union Army, in spite of fighting for freedom, right, they considered us contraband. So even then, they considered us as property. We were contraband. But yet you had hundreds of thousands of formerly enslaved black men who wanted to fight for themselves, who wanted to fight for their own freedom. Lincoln was afraid of what would happen if hundreds of thousands of black men got guns. He didn't want us to fight. And so that's when I met with President Lincoln. Things at the time, timing was good, because at the time, things weren't going very well for the Union Army. They had lost a couple of battles. The Confederacy had come into Maryland and a couple other places, and so into edges of Pennsylvania. And so they needed more people. And so I was able to convince Lincoln to allow these men to fight for their own freedom. And of course, we know about the famous 54th of Massachusetts and so many other men who fought for their freedom. We know of many men who live right here in North Carolina. We know about the men, for example, coming out of Alamance County, just down the road from here, who left this county and went to fight for freedom. So that was my visit with Lincoln. I will say that the visit was interesting because when I first went there, and of course I came through the front door, and they didn't think I belonged there. And after a delay, they eventually let me in, and I was able to meet with President Lincoln, and our brave young men were able to fight for their freedom. Most would say that allowing those formerly enslaved Africans to fight turned the tide of the war. It turned the tide of the war. Maybe one more question. Yes, sir.
Yes, I was curious. Harriet Tubman lived with a slave in the same area that you were and everything like that. Did you ever, in the early days or afterwards, met with her and did any common work?
Harriet Tubman, of course, was a great leader. She was someone that I corresponded with. She was someone that I didn't always agree with. We were both recruited by John Brown to be a part of the raid at Harper's Ferry, and we both wisely decided that it wasn't a good idea for us to be involved. I actually, see if I still have it here. I have a letter that I sent to her, actually, you allow me to read it to you, because I really admired her, right? So this was written in this 1868, and they were writing a book about her, which I thought was incredible, and I thought was should have been done a long time ago, before 1868. But here's the letter that I sent to her. Dear Harriet, I am glad to know your eventful life has been written by a kindly lady, and the same is soon to be published. You ask for what you do not need when you call upon me for a word of recommendation. I need such words from you far more than you can need them from me, especially where your superior labors and devotion to the cause of the lately enslaved of our land are known as I know them. The difference between us is very marked. Most that I have done and suffered in service of our cause has been in public, and I have received much encouragement at every step of the way. You, on the other hand, have labored in a private way. I have wrought in the day, you in the night. I have had the applause of the crowd and the satisfaction that comes with being approved by the multitudes, while the most that you have done has been witnessed by a few trembling, scared, footsore bondsmen and women whom you have led out of the house of bondage, and whose heartfelt God bless you has been your only reward. The midnight sky, the silent stars have been the witnesses to your devotion to freedom and to your heroism. Excepting John Brown of sacred memory, I know of no one who has willingly encountered more perils and hardship to serve our enslaved people as you have. Much that you have done would seem improbable to those who do not know you as I know you. It is to me a great pleasure and a great privilege to bear testimony to your character, your works, and to say to those to whom may come that I regard you in every way truthful and trustworthy. Your friend, Frederick Douglass. Well, again, I want to thank you for having me here. I was very, very happy to be invited to come again to this land of the Friends. I've always admired the work that has happened here on this sacred ground. Again, I thank you.